Now, the most important, the central concept in Nexus that you also see here in UI is managing repositories. Because Nexus is a repository manager. This means you can have multiple repositories of different formats, like Helm charts, Docker images, Java archive files, JavaScript artifacts, etc. And by default, you see some repositories have already been created in the repository list. So you get these repositories out of the box. When we deploy Nexus, it creates them because these are probably the most used ones. So in most of the cases, you will need these repositories. And you also see that each repository has a type. Either it's a hosted repository, a group, or a proxy repository. So let's go through these types and let's see what these types actually represent. First of all, let's look at a proxy repository type. This is a repository that is linked to a remote repository. For example, Maven Central Repository is a remote public repository for Maven artifacts, which you, if you're a developer, can download jar files, other artifacts and dependencies for your application. So proxy repository is a link to that remote repository. If a component is requested from the remote repository by your application, for example, you're trying to download a library with a specific version from Maven Central, it will go through the proxy instead of directly to remote. And first check whether the component is available locally on Nexus, on the company Nexus, so to say. If yes, your application that you're developing within the company will take it from Nexus. If it's not there yet, the request will be forwarded to remote repository. The component will then be retrieved from remote and stored locally in Nexus. So Nexus will act as a cache. So when the next request is made, either by you for the same application or maybe from a different team that also needs that library, that component, again, it will go through Nexus and it will see that dependency, that component is already there, cached, so to say. So no need to fetch the component from repository. Now, what advantages does this have? First of all, it saves network bandwidth and time for retrieving the component from remote on every request, right? You just need to do it once, and then consecutive requests can just use the cached version. And you see by default, Nexus comes with Maven Central Proxy Repository and NuGet.org Proxy Repository. And if we actually go in this Maven Central repository view, here you see all the different attributes that are set for this repository. You have the format and the type, URL, which we'll use to access that repository and get some information out of it. You have the proxy configuration here. This is the location of Maven repository. This is the main repository of Maven dependencies. So we are proxying to that remote storage. You can also change it actually and set it to some other location. However, mostly you would use this location because it makes sense to proxy to the most used and most common remote repositories. And here you have a bunch of other configuration which is relevant for proxy repositories only. You don't have to know and understand each one of those in details, but just to give you an overview, here we can configure, for example, how long should the cached version of a certain component be stored in Nexus before Nexus tries to refresh or update to see if there are any changes to that, as well as some connection and security configuration and so on. So let's go back to the list of our repositories. Another advantage of using a proxy repository instead of fetching from the remote directly is that it is giving developers a single endpoint, repository endpoint, instead of each developer team managing their own logic in their build tool or package manager configuration. So basically you configure in your build tool, if it's a Maven or Gradle or NPM or whatever it is, you configure one endpoint, which is going to be this repository, this Nexus Repository Manager. And then all the package download requests will go to Nexus, and Nexus will manage, so to say, the rest. And also this is an advantage when you have multiple teams working on different projects, so they can actually use the same versions or same dependencies that other developers in other projects have used. So this can actually make this whole process more efficient. Now, as you see by default, Nexus comes with proxy repositories already. You have a Maven Central proxy repository and NuGet proxy repository. Both of these repositories are default component repositories for their respective package manager tools. So you can use Maven Central Proxy for your Java dependencies, and if you're developing .NET applications, you can use the NuGet proxy repository, etc. And this is the best practice in companies to set up proxy repositories for the default remote repositories for that specific repository type. So if you have multiple Java applications you are developing in your organization, each requiring the same Spring Boot package or JUnit library, for example, which probably every Java Spring application will need, they will get it from proxy from Nexus instead of going to Maven Central Repository all the time. And same would be for Docker images or NPM packages. You can configure proxy for Docker images using Docker Hub or maybe some other repository, whatever you want. And same thing for NPM. And of course, in addition to the existing ones that come by default out of the box when you start Nexus, you can create your own repositories for different projects. And in the create step, you have the list of different repository formats and also repository types that you can choose from. So if you go through the list, we have repository types for Ruby, Yum, Python, Maven, Helm, Docker, and so on. So you have all these different formats and type combinations. And if we choose Docker proxy, for example, here you see the create form, and here a bunch of fields to fill out. You don't have to know and understand all of this. Now we're gonna get to this step by step. However, as I said, for a proxy repository, you usually configure a URL, which is the remote repository that you are proxying to. And you can choose whatever that URL is. If you have a Docker repository on AWS, or if there's some public repository somewhere else, you can add that URL. Probably the default will be, or the most common use case for creating proxies is to connect them with the standard repositories or the main public repositories for that format. For Docker, it is Docker Hub, which is also suggested here. So you can just choose this one if you want. And as I said, you have a bunch of other configuration here, which we're gonna cover in later sessions. Now, another repository type is hosted repository. And this is a repository that is the primary storage for artifacts and components. For example, for the company-owned components, this is the typical use case where everything that is developed within the company, all the applications, the artifacts are being stored in Nexus hosted repository. So this is the primary location for these artifacts. So in this case, company's Nexus is the primary or even only place sometimes that stores these components. By default, in Nexus, you see we have Maven releases, Maven snapshots, NuGet hosted repositories. Maven releases and Maven snapshots repositories are Maven 2 repository formats, and each one has the version policies integrated for releases and snapshots respectively. And these repositories will be used by Maven or Gradle projects to store Java artifacts, for example. So the common practice or the best practice is that when you're developing an application, for example, in Java, you have this development version of your artifact. So you release a development version to be tested, and that will be a snapshot version. And when you actually test that and it's ready to be released to production, then you have actual releases, and this will end in Maven releases repository. So this way, these two are separated. The name of the version, the naming can also be different. And as I said, these repository types have integrated version policies for managing these artifacts. Maven releases is intended to be the repository where your organization publishes internal releases. You can also use this repository for third-party components that are not available in public or external repositories and can therefore not be retrieved via proxy repository. For example, this could be commercial libraries, some proprietary libraries such as Oracle JDBC driver that may be referenced by your organization, right? So they're not externally available. So you can create a proxy to fetch directly from them, but you can host it on this hosted repository as company internal component, even though it's not made by your company, right? It's a third-party library dependency for your applications. Maven Snapshots is intended to be the repository where your organization publishes internal development versions. And these development versions are also called snapshots. And as a third type, we have a repository group. And this is a powerful feature of Nexus Repository Manager because you may have multiple individual repositories in Nexus, and each one has its own purpose. However, if you need to use multiple of these repositories in your application, obviously you don't want to configure endpoints of all of these different repositories, right? You want to kind of address them using just one endpoint and then have all these different repositories behind that single endpoint, right? So that you don't have to manage all those different repository endpoints in the project. And this type of repository basically allows you to combine multiple repositories and even other repository groups in a single repository. And this means that Nexus users, developers, for example, developer teams, they can use a single URL for their application, which will give them access to multiple repositories at once instead of working with separate URLs for each repository. So Nexus administrators, this could be DevOps engineers, for example, can configure and add repositories to such a group. And then Nexus users, which could be developer teams, can use the URL of that group. Instead of maintaining the repository endpoints of individual repositories like Maven Proxy, Maven Hosted, Maven Snapshots, etc., you can give developers a single endpoint to maintain.